afternoon. My name is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History. I'm going to be starting a new show, quite a few new episodes, called The Road to Andersonville. And slide one there, we're going to be covering a lot of these soldiers right here that actually never made it out of Andersonville. And we're going to develop this whole story. I think you'll find it quite interesting. Go to the next slide. Now, I found this great picture here. This is on my wife's side, James Swan. He was born in Thomaston, Connecticut, and he ended up in Andersonville. And that's actually, I enhanced that a little bit. That's the actual picture of his house where he was born and lived in Thomaston, Connecticut. And we'll go to the next slide. And these three soldiers will play an important part of this here. They were in the 19th Connecticut Infantry, which was mustered in September 1862. Colonel Elisha Kellogg, very important, Major William Ells, and of course Private James Strunk. I was fortunate to have a lot of these pictures right here. We'll go to the next slide. And when they enlisted in the 19th Volunteer Infantry, this terrific, I almost call it a poster, was given to everyone that was a member of the 19th. And of course, there's Private James Strunk on the left, and there's Major William Ells on the right. And this is the, I'll hold this right up here. Here's the actual, just to give you this thing. It's a nice piece of history. And it's got every member that's in there is in this here. And it's a tremendous, tremendous find that we had in the, found up in the attic, listing all the soldiers. Okay. And they also had these two items here I found. It was in a miscellaneous cardboard box, and it wasn't even indicated what their names were at all. This gentleman here is Colonel Kellogg, which I did a lot of research and found out about. And that's an original picture, Civil War picture, and have a second one here. It's one of James's commanders. And the other one here is Major Ells. And that's an original picture too, which is amazing. There it is. And we found this one out there, very, very faint on the back of the picture. It has his name on it. So we're going to begin this story. Go to the next slide. And this is a picture of the 19th Connecticut Infantry. They were mustered in Litchfield, Connecticut, September 1862. And it's too bad we can't identify all those soldiers. It's certainly a part of Connecticut history. We'll go to the next slide. And Camp Dutton, there's a monument placed after the Civil War to the 19th Connecticut Infantry. And afterwards they were transferred, and they all became the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, mustered into service on this field. It's right on an open field, and they were mustered into service on September 11th, 1862. And James Swan was there, and his immediate commander was Major William Ells. I was fortunate to get those two photographs. We'll go to the next slide. And this is an original picture too of Camp Dutton, Litchfield, Connecticut, September 1862. And you can see all the soldiers now. They've all got their uniforms on. They're all together. They're all going through drill and ceremonies and getting ready to respond to the call to duty for the American Civil War. We'll go to the next slide. And once again, now they're the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, and they were sent down, the first assignment, protecting Washington, D.C. in 1863. because the Confederates, once again, the capital was in Richmond and Washington was right there. And the biggest thing they wanted to do was reinforce Washington, D.C. in case there was a attack by the Southern Army. We'll go to the next slide. And I found this on the internet. He was assigned to Fort Lyon, Virginia. And here's an actual map of Fort Lyon. And you can see I've got circled here, the first red circle on the left is where they kept all the ammunition or cannonballs. And you can see there's 3 different sites like that. And on the right, you can see that's a section there with 5 different cannons. And you can see now you can see the cannons all the way around this fort. And if you look closely, they cleared it out. They put a trench all around the fort, and they cut down all the trees around it. And it's quite a fort, Fort Lyon. It was actually in Alexandria, Virginia, guarding Washington, D.C. We'll go to the next slide. And this picture was taken there also. That's the Fort Lyon, Virginia, 1863, and that's where Private James Swan was. We'll go to the next slide. And I often wondered, we had some items in the family that were part of James Strong's. We wondered how in the world he got those, because once he got into the Civil War, he never came back to Connecticut. Then I came across this. It was just a small piece of paper. And it's a pass to go to Fort Lyon. And it was for his wife, Mrs. James Strunk. October 2nd, 1863, Headquarters Military District, Washington, D.C. It's a pass for 1 day, non-transferable. And so this actually verifies the fact that his wife actually came to the fort to visit them down in Washington, D.C. So that's quite a document to have. We'll go to the next slide. And when he was in Washington, D.C., now they were heavy artillery, and he was assigned to these smaller cannons. They call it a 6-pound cannon. And the cannonball, you can see there, it's made of cast iron, weighs 6.1 pounds. And that's the cannon that, it's an original Civil War photograph that's been colorized. That's the cannon that they would have used. And I have one of these right here on my desk. This is the one he got. And we wondered how in the world did his wife ever get a cannonball? And actually, how in the world did his wife ever get a canteen? And so I did a little detective work, and with that pass, it's all coming together. She probably went down to visit him, and he gave her both of these items as souvenirs. So you never know how you can put a story together. So we'll go to the next slide. And here's a picture of, he had a few of his letters, and this is a story that coincides with one of the letters. White House, May 1861. Now, got to remember, Fort Sumter was in April 1861, so this is in right away. And what happened was President Lincoln, he had his aide there, Colonel Ellsworth on the right, and he went out in the front of the White House, saw right across the river, and there was Virginia. And the day after they seceded from the Union, they ran up a Confederate flag in the tallest building in Virginia. And Colonel Ellsworth could see that President Lincoln was really upset about that, having to sit there and look out that window. So he told President Lincoln, "I'm going to capture that flag and bring it back to you." It's a true story. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's the Confederate flag, what it looked like earlier in the war. And there's what they call the Marshall House, Alexandria, Virginia, and the Confederate flag was raised right on the top of that. Then we'll go to the next slide. I like this picture a lot. There shows the Marshall House. You can see the small detachment. Colonel Ellsworth went. The South didn't believe it, weren't even prepared. He walked right across the bridge, over to Alexandria, went up all the way up the stairs to the top, and he took the flag down. And the owner was a fellow by the name of James Jackson. He was the owner, Confederate owner of that particular hotel. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's a great picture there, which has been colorized. It shows Ellsworth coming down the stairs with a Confederate flag, and James Jackson was the owner. He pulled out his double-barrel shotgun, and when Ellsworth came down the stairs, he unloaded both barrels right into his stomach and killed him instantly. And he was shot by the other soldier that was with Ellsworth right at the same time. And this is important history because it's the first Union officer killed in the Civil War, in May of 1861. It was a national story across all papers in the United States. We'll go to the next slide. And you're probably wondering what this has to do with Andersonville. Well, Private James Swan, he wrote a letter. There's a picture of his letter. You can see it was old, and fortunately the family saved some of his letters. And if you go to the next slide, I'll read it to you, and you can read it right on here. Dated October 12th, 1862, dear sister. Gives you an idea of what he had to do in guarding Washington, D.C. We have to work very hard since our regiment is guarding the city, and it is guard duty all the time, night and day. And now this is about almost a year and a half or so after the Marshall House incident. And he continues, I went to the Marshall House the other day. That is where Colonel Ellsworth was shot. I went up the stairs to the door where James Jackson stood when he fired the fatal gun. I took my knife and cut a piece off the door. I would have taken a piece of the stair, but there was none of the old steps left by people just taking little chips off. I have sent it home to his namesake in a letter as a relic to his memory, which I hope he will bear as a good a name as his predecessor, signed James Swan. So we verified that he was where he was in Washington, D.C. We verified that his wife came and visited him. We also verified that he was at the Marshall House probably a year later. Well, the next slide. Now let's take a look at what kind of a fort they had. These are some of the heavy artillery, Fort Lyon, Virginia, 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. And you can see, from the other map that we had, there's many of these cannons all the way around the perimeter of the fort. We'll go to the next slide. And he's got another letter here. He wrote it when he was in Fort Lyon, Virginia. Just to give you an idea what they were doing. I'll begin. It's been some time since I wrote to you. We have had a pretty hard tramp through the country hunting for Confederate guerrillas, but we had not much luck to find them. We only got 5 prisoners in all, a few horses, and 2 mules. We were gone just 5 days, and we marched almost 60 miles in that time. We had to carry 60 rounds of ammunition besides all our equipment and only a few days' rations. We had to live off the fat of the country, or in other words, steal what we could lay our hands on. Joseph Wadsworth is dead, but he is only now amongst the many that have gone before him. Signed, James Swan. We'll go to the next slide. And here's the Manassas, Virginia Railroad Yard. And this Manassas Railroad, Confederate Railroad, is going to play a little part in the next story here as we continue. So we will go to the next slide. And we've got another letter here dated June 1st, 1863. And he's here at Fort Lyon. I'll continue. There is a great excitement around here. There is a force of Rebs within a short distance from here, but how strong they are we cannot say. Some think about 120,000. We have one great advantage. We will be in our fortifications. Our big guns are all trained to bear on the surrounding countryside. Our men have been felling trees across the roads and digging rifle pits. There was a train captured 4 miles beyond where we go for wood. I should not be surprised if they capture our wood party one of these fine days. I never told you before that about 100 of our regiment goes after wood every day out by the Manassas Railroad. So we'll go to the next slide. That's a great shot of the Manassas Railroad there, and that they're actually, you can see the Confederate workers. They're working on the side of the railroad, and that's probably in an area somewhere where James and his wood party were at that particular point in time in history. So we'll go to the next slide. Now we're going to continue on to Cold Harbor, Virginia. And this is a picture of the Burnett Inn. This was June 4th, 1864. And of course, they were still guarding Washington, D.C., but now General Grant ordered their unit down to Cold Harbor because they're going to have a big attack there. And Cold Harbor was very important because two rural crossroads met there. It was a shelter for travelers 10 miles east of Richmond. You can see how close it was. And the reason they called it Cold Harbor is because they didn't serve any hot meals. So we'll go to the next slide. And I really like these pictures. They're amazing. They've all been colorized. Picture of General Grant and 4 of his officers in the artillery. And this was taken at Cold Harbor, Virginia. General Grant's getting ready for a big offensive. He wants to push on to Richmond. We'll go to the next slide. Now, Cold Harbor, Virginia, these folks were involved in there, and that's probably set up one of the Union defenses. Private James Swan, 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. Private William Walker, 7th Massachusetts Infantry, and Private David Dean, 7th Massachusetts Infantry. They're all going to end up in Andersonville. And of course, Private James Swan, what General Grant did, he said, look, we're going to have an attack. The 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery is going to be used as infantry. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, Robert E. Lee understood what was going on, and he really reinforced Cold Harbor. It's a picture of Robert E. Lee going into Cold Harbor. And on the right, you can see the defenses. Now he put up logs in front of all the defenses, and it was really quite a place now. Well, the next slide. Now here's an actual picture of the Confederate defenses of Cold Harbor. You can see what Robert E. Lee did. They're quite formidable. All the cannons are all here. They're all reinforced fort right around here, and they're just waiting for General Grant. We'll go to the next slide. And I did a little comparison here, Cold Harbor, Virginia. If you go there today, on the left, that's the Confederate position. That's what it looked like in 1864. And on the right, that's what it looks like today. You can see actually where the positions were, where the trenches were in this very significant battle in the Civil War. We'll go to the next slide. Now, at the Battle of Cold Harbor, you can see it was quite a battle. It lasted from May 31st to June 12th, 1864. And the 2nd Connecticut Artillery was used as infantry. Apparently, after they opened up with their artillery positions, then they shut that down and went back into their infantry for the attack. And then we'll go to the next slide. Now, we had in our history, my father-in-law always talked about James and how he was captured, and it's passed down in history. And he said in the Battle of Cold Harbor, James and his party, work party, if you will, went out. And of course, from the previous letter, James said basically that they would go out for wood. They also, now, since they're in the field, they also need water. You can imagine a all the General Grant's troops, and they need water. So what they would do is they would take select soldiers, maybe up to 100, and they would take everybody else's canteen, strap as many canteens as they could, and they would head out into Confederate lines. Of course, it's in the woods, so you have to be very careful here, where there was a natural spring. They knew this spring here, and the spring is called Bloody Run. It was named that because of the battle, and so many soldiers were killed in this area. So here we are. We've got James with William Walker and Private David Dean of this all together. They're all New England boys, and they all got a lot of canteens, and they're quietly heading out. They start filling all their canteens with water, if you can imagine that. And then the Confederates, they attacked them. The party attacked them, and those 3 soldiers were all captured. And that's an actual picture of the stream in Cold Harbor. So my wife's family now, we never had an opportunity to go down to Cold Harbor, but now at least she can see what the stream or the creek looked like. So we'll go to the next slide. And this battle was just amazing. I mean, the number of forces, and General Grant, he had won so many victories now, and Lincoln was he was his #1 general, and he just kept on pursuing the fight. And in this battle, Private James Swan, he was captured by the creek, and he was sent to Andersonville Prison with those 2 other soldiers from New England and others. Wounded was Major William Ells. I showed you his picture. And one of the major attacks on the right there, Colonel Elisha Kellogg was seen right in the front of the attack, waving his sword, and instantaneously 2 of the Confederate sharpshooters, 2 shots were hit right to his head, and he died instantly. So we'll go to the next slide. And this battle was really amazing. I just sort of recap here for you. The Union had 110,000 men against a rebel force of 60,000. So the Union outnumbered the rebel force, but they were defensive positions. The Union casualties, I had to check this figure here, it's amazing. 12,738 were either killed or wounded. Rebel casualties, only 5,287. So Robert E. Lee, this was a tremendous Confederate victory. But in history, the Battle of Cold Harbor, no other battle in the Civil War had this many soldiers killed in the shortest amount of time. 7,000 Union soldiers were killed in the first 20 minutes in the first charge under General Grant. That's really hard to believe. That's really hard to believe. And it was a great Confederate victory. So we'll go to the next slide. Now here's a picture of General Grant. And he wrote this June 12, 1864. Quote, "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made," signed General Grant. And that was the worst stain on his military record. Go to the next slide. Now, the Colonel Elisha Kellogg, who was killed, his body was taken back to Connecticut, and it's at the Forest View Cemetery, Winston, Connecticut. 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, the monument right there. There's his picture. And on the right is this great obelisk to his memory. And we'll go to the next slide. And James Swan, now, he was part of the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, which was used exclusively as infantry. And his unit, the 2nd Connecticut, in that first attack, or the second attack that General Grant ordered, 330 out of the 1,500 in the regiment were killed outright. That's 22%. And on the right is a famous monument there, just dedicated to the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. Grant had them lead the charge, and it honors all those folks there. Go to the next slide. And that really concludes our part 1, which was the Cold Harbor, and we covered Connecticut and a couple of Massachusetts soldiers that were captured and ultimately sent down to Andersonville. So this is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History. Have a good evening.